What if everything we know about the first civilizations is wrong? Right now, you can open any history textbook and it'll tell you the same story. Civilization began around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Before that, humans were just hunter-gatherers wandering around with stone tools. That's the story. That's what we've been taught. But here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Civilizations, as we define them, have only existed for 5,000. That means 98% of human history is basically invisible to us. Think about that for a second. 295,000 years of human experience, human ingenuity, human achievement, and we have almost nothing to show for it. A few stone tools, some cave paintings, scattered bones, that's it. The vast majority of our story as a species has simply vanished. Now, conventional archaeology will tell you that's because nothing much happened during those 295,000 years. Humans were primitive. They hadn't figured out agriculture yet. They didn't build cities or develop writing, they just survived. But what if that's not the whole story? What if absence of evidence isn't actually evidence of absence? See, we have this assumption baked into how we think about the past. We assume that if something existed, we'd find traces of it. Buildings leave ruins. Tools leave artifacts. Civilizations leave evidence, right? Except when they don't. Because here's the thing about deep time that nobody really talks about. It erases everything. A wooden structure lasts maybe a few hundred years before it rots away completely. Stone buildings can survive longer, but even the pyramids are crumbling after just 4,500 years. Now imagine 50,000 years passing, or 100,000, or 200,000. Glaciers advance and retreat, grinding everything in their path to dust. Sea levels rise and fall by hundreds of feet, swallowing coastlines whole. Rivers change course, mountains erode, forests become deserts, deserts become oceans. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all at once. The Earth is constantly recycling itself, destroying evidence of everything that came before. And most civilizations, if they were smart, would have built where resources were abundant. Near water, on fertile plains, along coastlines, exactly the places that are now underwater or buried under hundreds of feet of sediment. This is what I call the ghost civilization problem. How do you find evidence of something that had 100,000 years to disappear completely? But here's where it gets interesting. Even though we shouldn't expect to find much evidence of ancient, sophisticated cultures, we keep finding things that don't quite fit the timeline, anomalous artifacts that appear too advanced for their supposed age, geological formations that look suspiciously artificial. Most intriguing of all, oral traditions from cultures around the world describing advanced ancestors, great floods, lost continents, and cities that sank beneath the waves. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most of this as coincidence, misidentification, or mythology. And to be fair, a lot of it probably is. But what if some of it isn't? What if scattered across the globe, hiding in plain sight, are clues to civilizations that rose and fell long before we thought civilization was even possible? This isn't about ancient aliens or Atlantis, at least not in the way pop culture imagines them. This is about recognizing how little we actually know about the deep human past. It's about understanding that the archaeological record is not a complete library of human history. It's more like a few random pages torn from a million books and scattered across a continent. Consider this. The oldest known megalithic structure in the world is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It's nearly 12,000 years old, and it completely rewrote what we thought we knew about prehistoric humans. Before its discovery in the 1990s, archaeologists insisted that hunter-gatherers couldn't organize large-scale construction projects. They didn't have the social structure or the resources. Then we found Göbekli Tepe, massive carved pillars arranged in circles, clearly requiring hundreds of workers and sophisticated planning. The experts were wrong, and if they were wrong about that, what else might they be wrong about? The question isn't whether advanced civilizations existed 100,000 years ago. The question is, would we even know if they had? And more importantly, are we looking in the right places, asking the right questions, or are we so committed to our timeline of human progress that we're blind to evidence hiding in the gaps? Tonight, we're going on a journey into those gaps, into the shadows of deep time where entire worlds might have risen and fallen without leaving a trace we'd recognize. We're going to explore the problem with finding ancient evidence, examine artifacts that challenge our assumptions, dive beneath the waves to submerged lands, and ask a question that sounds like science fiction, but is actually deadly serious. Could there have been industrial civilizations on Earth millions of years before humans even existed? Welcome to the age of invisible civilizations. Here's something that should make you uncomfortable. The ground beneath your feet is a liar. The landscape you see around you, the mountains, the valleys, the coastlines, they're all temporary. Fleeting arrangements of rock and soil that will look completely different in a geological eye blink. And everything we've ever built, everything we think of as permanent, is dissolving back into the earth right now, molecule by molecule, leaving almost nothing behind. This is the problem with deep time. Not just that it's hard to imagine. That's obvious. Nobody can really wrap their mind around 1,000,000 years, let alone 100 million. The real problem is that deep time actively erases evidence. The further back you look, the less there is to see, not because nothing happened, but because the planet itself is constantly resurfacing, like a snake shedding skin over and over again. Let's start with something simple: sea level. Right now, at this moment, we're living in what geologists call an interglacial period, a warm spell between ice ages, and during warm spells the oceans are high, very high. But for most of the last 2 million years, sea levels have been dramatically lower than they are today. During the last glacial maximum, just 20,000 years ago, which is nothing in geological terms, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are now. 400 feet. That's a 40-story building of water that wasn't there. What does this mean? It means the coastlines were completely different. Enormous areas that are now underwater were dry land. The British Isles were connected to mainland Europe by a massive plain called Doggerland. You could walk from France to England without getting your feet wet. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia. Australia was connected to New Guinea and Tasmania, forming a massive continent called Saul. The Persian Gulf didn't exist. It was a river valley. The Mediterranean coastline extended miles beyond where it is now. These weren't marginal territories. These were prime real estate, river deltas, coastal plains, areas with reliable fresh water, abundant fish and game. Exactly the kind of places where people would want to live, where they would build settlements, develop technologies, create cultures. And now they're all underwater, covered by hundreds of feet of ocean, blanketed by thousands of years of marine sediment. If a sophisticated civilization had existed on these coastal plains 50,000 years ago, where would the evidence be? At the bottom of the ocean, buried under sediment layers that are tens of meters thick in places. We've barely scratched the surface of underwater archaeology. Most of the research focuses on shipwrecks from the last few thousand years, not prehistoric settlements. We're not looking for older civilizations underwater because we don't expect to find them, but that's exactly where they would be. And it's not just sea level, it's erosion. Constant, relentless, inexorable erosion. Wind, water, ice, chemical weathering, they're all working every second of every day to break down everything on the surface. Mountains erode at rates of millimeters to centimeters per year. That doesn't sound like much, but multiply it over 100,000 years and you've removed 10 to 100 meters of material. Everything that was on the surface 100 millennia ago is gone, carried away, by rivers scattered as dust by winds dissolved by acidic rain. The Grand Canyon is a mile deep. It took around 6 million years to form. That's erosion. The canyon cuts through rock layers that are billions of years old, exposing the geological history of the planet. But anything that was on the surface when that erosion started, any settlements, any structures, any artifacts, they're gone, crushed to powder and washed into the Gulf of California. Then there's sedimentation. While some areas are being eroded away, others are being buried. River valleys fill with sediment at rates of centimetres to metres per century. Deserts expand and contract, burying and exposing areas repeatedly. Volcanic eruptions can bury entire regions under meters of ash in a matter of hours. And over deep time, these processes compound. A city from 200,000 years ago could easily be buried under 50 to 100 meters of sediment. You'd have to know exactly where to dig and have the resources to excavate through all that overburden. And even then, what would you find? This brings us to the preservation problem, the uncomfortable truth that archaeologists don't always emphasize because it makes their field sound almost hopeless. Most of what human civilizations create vanishes completely within centuries. Wood decays. Under most conditions, wooden structures and artifacts last maybe a few hundred years before they're completely gone. Not just rotted, but completely decomposed, returned to soil, leaving no trace whatsoever. Yes, under very specific conditions, extraordinary preservation, wood can survive for thousands of years. Waterlogged environments, extremely dry deserts, frozen permafrost. But these are exceptions, rare accidents of chemistry and climate. The vast majority of wooden objects from the past are simply gone. Textiles, even worse, cloth, rope, baskets, leather, all organic materials, they decay faster than wood. Most textiles survive only decades or at most a few centuries. We have virtually no textiles from before a few thousand years ago, and the ones we do have come from the most extraordinary preservation contexts imaginable. Egyptian tombs sealed in the desert, bodies frozen in glaciers. The statistical probability of a textile surviving 100,000 years is essentially zero. Paper, forget it. Paper survives maybe a few hundred years under ideal archival conditions. Under normal environmental conditions, it's gone in decades. Any civilization that kept its records on paper, or papyrus, or bark, or any other organic writing material, those records are gone. We'll never read them. We'll never even know they existed. Metal lasts longer, but not as long as you'd think. Iron corrodes. Leave an iron tool exposed to weather and it'll rust away in decades to centuries. Even buried iron objects rarely survive more than a few thousand years. Bronze lasts longer, copper longer still. Gold and platinum are basically indestructible. But most civilizations don't make most of their tools from gold. They use iron, bronze, wood, bone, materials that vanish. Stone is different. Stone can last. Not forever. Erosion gets everything eventually, but stone structures can survive for tens of thousands of years if conditions are right. This is why our picture of ancient civilizations is so dominated by monumental stone architecture. Not because most ancient people built with stone, but because stone is almost the only thing that survives. The Egyptians built the pyramids, and the pyramids are still there, so we know a lot about Egyptian civilization. But the Egyptians also built millions of mud brick houses, farms, workshops, warehouses. Those are mostly gone. What we see is a tiny, highly biased sample of what actually existed. Now imagine a civilization that didn't build with stone. Maybe they lived in forested areas with abundant timber. Maybe they built sophisticated wooden structures, complex multi-story buildings with advanced joinery and engineering. Maybe they had written language recorded on bark or hide. Maybe they had textiles, pottery, metalworking, everything we associate with civilization, and maybe they thrived for 1,000 years before a climate catastrophe, disease, war, or environmental collapse ended them. How much evidence would survive 100,000 years? Probably nothing. Maybe a few scattered stone tools if they used them. Maybe some pottery fragments if they made ceramics. and if those ceramics happened to be in a context that preserved them. But no buildings, no books, no textiles, no clear indication that they were anything more than hunter-gatherers living in small bands. We would completely miss them. Not because they didn't exist, but because time and geology erased them. Don't believe it? Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine humanity disappears tomorrow. Everybody vanishes, but all our cities, infrastructure, and artifacts remain. How long would they last? Scientists who study this, and yes, this is an actual field of research, have run the numbers. The results are humbling. Within 50 years, most wooden structures would be severely decayed or collapsed. Buildings with wooden frames, roofs, floors, gone or unrecognizable. Metal structures would be rusting aggressively. Within 500 years, most buildings would have collapsed. Even concrete structures would be breaking down as water infiltrated. Steel reinforcement rusted and expanded, cracking the concrete from inside. Roads would be buried under vegetation and soil. Within 5,000 years, most cities would be unrecognizable. They'd look like hills covered in vegetation, maybe with a few steel and concrete fragments protruding. Without active maintenance, dams would fail, bridges would collapse, and coastlines would be littered with degraded infrastructure being pounded by waves. Within 50,000 years, most traces would be gone, surface features would be eroded or buried. Metal objects would be corroded to unrecognizable lumps of rust. Glass might survive as fragments, but it would be scattered and weathered. Plastics would be degraded by UV radiation and microbial action. Yes, plastics break down. Not as fast as organic materials, but over tens of thousands of years they fragment, degrade, and eventually disappear. The most durable traces would be radioactive waste, some ceramics in very specific preservation contexts, and a few massive stone structures. Mount Rushmore might still be recognizable, some pyramid might still exist, but the vast majority of our civilization, all the buildings, roads, factories, homes, everything that makes up our actual lived environment, gone, erased by time, and that's just 50,000 years. Double it to 100,000 and even less would remain. Triple it to 150,000 years, and an archaeologist from an alien civilization would have a very hard time proving that industrial civilization had ever existed on Earth. They might find some odd geochemical signatures, unusual concentrations of certain elements, maybe some very weathered stone structures, but the full picture, the complexity, the technology, the sophistication, invisible. Now here's the mathematical problem that should keep you up at night. Let's say a civilization existed 200,000 years ago. We'll be generous and say it lasted 1,000 years, which is longer than most historical civilizations have managed. And let's say it was geographically limited, covering maybe the area of modern Egypt or Iraq, which is actually quite large for an ancient civilization. What are the odds we'd find evidence of it? First, we have to be looking in the right place. But 200,000 years ago, coastlines were different, river courses were different, even the locations of deserts and forests were different. The places where this civilization thrived might now be underwater, or buried under sediment, or eroded away completely. Let's generously estimate we have a 20% chance the evidence is even accessible. Second, we have to actually excavate in the right location. Archaeological excavations are expensive and time-consuming. We've excavated maybe 0.01% of potentially archaeological sites worldwide. So let's say we have a 0.01% chance of digging in the right spot. Third, evidence has to have survived. Given the preservation issues we've discussed, maybe 1% of their material culture would survive 200,000 years, and even that's optimistic. Most of it would be scattered fragments that wouldn't obviously indicate sophisticated civilization. Multiply those probabilities together. 0.20 times 0.1 times 0.1 equals 0.2. That's a 0.2% chance we'd find clear evidence of this civilization. Those are lottery ticket odds. Except you're not trying to win the lottery, You're trying to reconstruct human history. This is why the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about deep time, and we haven't even discussed climate catastrophes. The planet has a way of resetting itself periodically, burying or erasing whatever came before. Ice ages are the obvious example. During glacial maximums, ice sheets thousands of meters thick covered vast areas of North America, Europe, and Asia. Anything underneath that ice? Scraped away, ground to powder, scattered as glacial till. The Canadian Shield, that vast expanse of ancient rock across northern Canada, is so barren because glaciers scraped it clean over and over again. If an advanced civilization had existed in northern North America 150,000 years ago, the ice age that followed would have obliterated all evidence. But ice ages are just the most dramatic example. Supervolcano eruptions can bury entire regions under meters of ash. The Toba eruption, 74,000 years ago, deposited ash layers across South and Southeast Asia. Anything underneath that ash? Hidden. Preserved, maybe, if we're lucky and nowhere to dig, but hidden. Mega floods can reshape entire landscapes in days. The Missoula floods at the end of the last ice age carved the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, moving more water than all current rivers on Earth combined. Anything in their path, scoured away. And then there are slower catastrophes. Desertification can transform fertile regions into barren wastelands over centuries. The Sahara Desert was green savanna just 5,000 years ago, covered with lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Now it's sand. Any settlements from the Green Sahara are buried under dunes or scattered by wind erosion. Sea level rise drowns coastal civilizations, not dramatically but inexorably, meter by meter over centuries until everything is underwater. River course changes can bury cities or strip them away. Tectonic activity can uplift areas, exposing them to erosion, or subduct them, dragging them beneath other plates. The planet is not a museum. It's not carefully preserving evidence for future archaeologists. It's a dynamic, constantly changing system that recycles everything. Rock, soil, water, life, all of it moving through geological cycles that operate on timescales that make human civilization look like a flash of lightning. This is why stone monuments are so misleading. When we think of ancient civilizations, we think of the pyramids, Stonehenge, the Parthenon, massive stone structures that have survived thousands of years, and we assume that stone construction is the hallmark of civilization. If they were advanced, they would have built in stone, and we would find it. But that's backwards. Most cultures throughout history built with whatever materials were locally abundant and practical. In forested areas, that's wood. In grasslands, that's sod and thatch. In tropical areas, that's bamboo and palm fronds. Stone construction is actually rare. It requires specific geological resources, significant labour investment, and often serves specialised purposes: temples, tombs, fortifications, the everyday structures where people actually lived. Those were almost always made of perishable materials. The civilization of Great Zimbabwe in Africa built remarkable stone structures that still stand today. But those stone walls surrounded wooden buildings where people actually lived and worked. The wooden buildings are gone. If we only had the stone walls, we'd miss most of the picture of how these people lived. Now imagine if Great Zimbabwe had existed 50,000 years ago, instead of 1,000 years ago. The stone walls would be heavily eroded or buried. The wooden structures would be completely gone. We might find some scattered artifacts if we excavated in exactly the right place, but we'd have no clear picture of the civilization that created them. This is the problem with deep time. Every day that passes, evidence disappears. Every year, erosion removes more material. Every millennium, burial and chemical weathering make the past harder to read. And after 100,000 years, after 200,000 years, after 1,000,000 years, the odds of finding clear evidence of any civilization become vanishingly small. Unless they built massive stone monuments specifically designed to last. unless they inhabited areas with extraordinary preservation conditions, unless they left behind artifacts made of materials that survive deep time, and unless we happen to excavate in exactly the right places. So when someone asks, if earlier civilizations existed, where's the evidence? The answer might be underwater, buried under 50 meters of sediment, eroded away by 1,000,000 years of wind and rain, scraped clean by glaciers, scattered by floods, decomposed back into the earth, or just sitting there, waiting to be found in the 99.99% of potential archaeological sites we haven't excavated yet. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's exactly what we'd expect if deep time works the way geology tells us it does, erasing, burying, scattering, dissolving everything, leaving only the rarest, most durable traces for us to puzzle over. The planet keeps secrets, not because it's trying to hide them, but because that's what planets do. They recycle, they renew, they forget. And if we want to remember what came before, we have to work against geology itself, excavating the scattered fragments before time erases them completely. Every culture on Earth tells the same story. The details change, the names are different, but the core narrative remains eerily consistent. There was a great flood. Most of humanity died. A few survivors rebuilt civilization from scratch. The Mesopotamians told of Utnapishtim, who built a massive boat to survive a deluge sent by the gods. The Hebrew Bible speaks of Noah and his ark. In India, the Matsya Purana describes how Manu saved humanity from a world-destroying flood. The Greeks had Deucalion. The Chinese spoke of Gunyu taming the great floods. Australian Aboriginal peoples tell of a time when the sea rose and swallowed the coastal lands. Here's what's strange. These aren't just neighbouring cultures sharing stories. We're talking about people separated by thousands of miles of ocean, mountain ranges that would take months to cross, deserts that ancient travellers couldn't have navigated. And yet, they all remember a flood. Not just any flood, but the flood. The one that ended the old world and began the new. Now, the standard explanation is straightforward. Most human settlements throughout history have been located near water, rivers, coastlines, fertile floodplains. Rivers flood. Coastlines get hit by tsunamis. It makes sense that cultures would develop flood myths because floods were genuinely terrifying events in their local history. Each culture experienced devastating floods independently, and each culture created myths to explain them. This explanation is logical, well supported by evidence, and accepted by mainstream archaeology. It's probably correct. But here's the thing that keeps a small group of researchers awake at night. The similarities aren't just thematic, they're specific. Too specific to be coincidence, too detailed to be simple metaphor. The flood myths don't just describe local floods, they describe a worldwide catastrophe. They specify timings before recorded history at the boundary between the old world and the new. They mention technological knowledge that survived the disaster, building techniques, astronomical observations, agricultural practices. They describe survivors who carried ancient wisdom into the post-flood world. And most unsettling of all, they often describe a civilization that existed before the flood, a sophisticated people who were wiped out, leaving only fragments of their knowledge behind. Graham Hancock has spent decades arguing that these myths aren't just folklore, they're memory, distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission mixed with religious and cultural elements, but fundamentally rooted in actual events. He proposes that there was a sophisticated Ice Age civilization, not necessarily with computers and electricity, but with advanced astronomy, sophisticated architecture, ocean-going vessels, and accumulated knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and engineering. This civilization flourished during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, and vast areas of continental shelf were dry land. Then came the catastrophe. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened. the climate underwent a sudden, violent shift. Temperatures that had been slowly warming suddenly plunged back into Ice Age conditions. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it's one of the most dramatic climate events in recent geological history. It lasted for roughly 1,200 years, a flash freeze that disrupted ecosystems worldwide. Massive ice sheets that had been slowly retreating suddenly stopped and even advanced. Sea levels fluctuated wildly. Animal populations collapsed. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended 11,600 years ago. What caused the Younger Dryas? For decades, scientists assumed it was part of natural climate variability, maybe changes in ocean currents or atmospheric circulation. But in recent years, a more dramatic hypothesis has gained traction. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid broke apart in the inner solar system and fragments slammed into Earth's ice sheets. The impacts would have caused catastrophic flooding as millions of tons of ice instantly melted, massive wildfires ignited by the airburst, a nuclear winter-style cooling as dust and debris filled the atmosphere. And if there was a civilization living on the low-lying coastal plains that are now underwater, they would have been completely destroyed, drowned by tsunamis, burned by wildfires, frozen by the sudden climate shift. The evidence is controversial but growing. Researchers have found a layer of sediment dating to exactly 12,800 years ago that contains unusual materials, nanodiamonds that form under extreme pressure, magnetic spherules created by intense heat, platinum anomalies that match the chemical signature of asteroids. Critics argue these could have natural explanations and that the evidence isn't strong enough to support such a dramatic claim. But the debate continues, and new data keeps emerging. And here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at when human civilization appears in the archaeological record, it's right after the Younger Dryas ends. Within a few thousand years of this catastrophic climate event, we suddenly see the emergence of agriculture in multiple places around the world. Complex architecture, sophisticated art. It's as if someone flipped a switch and humanity suddenly became civilized. The mainstream explanation is that this is when conditions became favorable for civilization. The climate stabilized. Resources became more abundant. Population densities increased. Necessity drove innovation. But Hancock and others ask a different question. What if the knowledge was already there? What if the survivors of the pre-Younger Dryas civilization spread out after the catastrophe, carrying fragments of their knowledge to different parts of the world, teaching the local hunter-gatherer populations agriculture, architecture, and astronomy? The evidence they point to is intriguing, even if it's not conclusive. Take Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. This site was built around 11,600 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. It consists of massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular structures and covered with sophisticated carved reliefs of animals. The weird part, the people who built it were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. They hadn't developed agriculture yet. They didn't have metal tools. They didn't live in permanent settlements. And yet they somehow organized the labor to quarry, transport, and erect these massive stones. They created art that shows detailed knowledge of animal anatomy. They built structures that demonstrate understanding of geometry and engineering. And then, after using the site for a few thousand years, they deliberately buried it. Filled in the entire complex with debris and covered it up. Why would people do that? What were they trying to preserve or hide? Some researchers see Göbekli Tepe as evidence of a knowledge transfer. Maybe the builders weren't simple hunter-gatherers. Maybe they were the descendants of refugees from the coastal civilizations destroyed by the Younger Dryas impacts. They carried knowledge of monumental architecture and sophisticated astronomy, but lacked the population and resources to rebuild their old civilization fully. So they created these temple complexes instead, preserving what they could and teaching what they knew to the local populations. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions provide another unsettling data point. For decades, anthropologists dismissed Aboriginal stories as simplistic myths. Then researchers started taking them seriously and checking the details against geological evidence. The results were shocking. Aboriginal stories describe geographical features that haven't existed for more than 10,000 years. Islands that are now submerged, land bridges that connected territories now separated by water, coastlines that match what we know the geography looked like during the last ice age. One story from the Great Barrier Reef describes when you could walk to islands that are now surrounded by ocean. Geological evidence confirms the sea level was low enough for this to be true, but only between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago. The stories have been passed down through at least 400 generations. The details remained accurate for 10,000 years. If Aboriginal traditions can preserve accurate geographical information for that long, what else might they preserve? Stories of people who came before, accounts of catastrophes that reshaped the world. Then there are the maps. In 1929, a Turkish museum discovered an ancient map drawn by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis in 1513. The map shows the Atlantic coast of South America, the Caribbean, and curiously, a coastline that appears to be Antarctica. But here's the problem. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and it's been covered by ice for millions of years. How could a 16th century map show Antarctic coastline details that should have been hidden under ice sheets miles thick? Hancock and others argue the map must have been copied from much older source maps. Maps that showed Antarctica as it looked before the ice covered it, which would put them at least 6,000 years old, possibly much older. Critics point out the Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis map doesn't actually match the real coastline under the ice. When researchers used modern sonar and radar to map what Antarctica looks like beneath the ice, it didn't correspond to what's shown on the ancient map. The shape is wrong, the proportions are off. It's probably just the southern coast of South America distorted by the map-making techniques of the time. But the controversy refuses to die because there are other anomalous maps showing geographical knowledge that shouldn't have existed. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 shows Antarctica as two land masses separated by water, which is actually correct. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is indeed two separate land masses. How did a 16th century cartographer know that? The standard answer is coincidence, or misidentification of other land masses, but it's a really specific coincidence. And then there's the original source of all these lost civilization theories, Plato's Atlantis. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, that described a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. According to Plato, Atlantis was technologically advanced, controlled a vast maritime empire, and possessed sophisticated knowledge of engineering and architecture. Then, in a single day and night, it was destroyed by earthquakes and floods and sank beneath the waves. For more than 2,000 years, people have debated whether Atlantis was real, or just a philosophical allegory Plato invented to make a point about political corruption. The mainstream view is clear. It's fiction, a cautionary tale about hubris. Plato made it up. There's no archaeological evidence for any such civilization. If a sophisticated island culture had controlled the Mediterranean for thousands of years, we'd have found traces of it by now. But others point out the details. Plato was very specific. He gave measurements for the city. He described its layout in precise geometric terms. He named sources for his information, Egyptian priests who allegedly preserved records going back thousands of years. He presented the story not as myth, but as history. Why would Plato, one of history's most influential philosophers, lie about something so specific? Maybe Atlantis wasn't in the Mediterranean at all. Maybe it was one of the coastal civilizations that existed on the now submerged continental shelves during the Ice Age. Maybe the story got garbled over thousands of years, confused, merged with other historical events. Maybe the time frame is wrong. Plato said 9,000 years, But what if it was 12,000 years? What if the destruction he described was actually the Younger Dryas catastrophe? Mainstream archaeology is skeptical of all this, and for good reasons. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The fact that myths are similar across cultures doesn't prove they're describing the same event. Oral traditions can preserve some information accurately, but they also distort and embellish over time. Ambiguous maps and ancient stories aren't sufficient evidence for an entire lost civilization. If such a civilization existed, where are the artifacts, the ruins, the trash heaps? Archaeological sites leave traces that persist for tens of thousands of years. If there was a sophisticated Ice Age civilization, we should have found definitive proof by now. But here's what archaeologists can't completely dismiss. We've barely explored the submerged continental shelves where any Ice Age coastal civilization would have been located. The overwhelming majority of underwater archaeological sites remain undiscovered. Climate catastrophes do happen. The Younger Dryas was real, and its cause remains debated. Göbekli Tepe is real, and it forces us to rethink what hunter-gatherers were capable of. And human memory, encoded in myth and story, can preserve information across vast stretches of time. So maybe there's nothing to these patterns. Maybe it's all coincidence and wishful thinking. Or maybe, just maybe, we're living in a world that was rebuilt after catastrophe. Walking on lands that once belonged to peoples whose names we've forgotten. Inheriting fragments of knowledge so old we mistake them for universal human intuition rather than memories of what came before. The flood myths remember something. We just don't know what. Here's where we need to challenge everything you think you know about what civilization actually means. When we hear ancient civilization, most of us picture pyramids, temples, written records, cities with streets and buildings. But that's just one type of civilization. One expression of human complexity that happened to leave behind stone monuments. What if there were other kinds? What if sophistication and advancement aren't measured by what survives, but by what was actually understood? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps archaeologists up at night. Anatomically modern humans, people with brains identical to yours, have existed for at least 200,000 years. Some estimates push it to 300,000 years. That's not disputed. That's established fact based on fossil evidence from sites across Africa. Think about what that means. For 195,000 years before the pyramids, humans with your exact cognitive capacity, your same potential for mathematics and philosophy and engineering, were walking around on this planet. What were they doing all that time? Just hitting rocks together and hunting gazelles. The standard archaeological narrative says yes, basically. It claims that for 95% of our existence as a species, we were primitive hunter-gatherers who didn't develop complex culture until maybe 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. Then suddenly, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, we invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, metallurgy, and civilization. This timeline has always bothered some researchers, not because they're trying to prove ancient aliens or lost Atlantean super-civilizations, but because the math just doesn't work. You can't have a species with sophisticated language, abstract reasoning, and creative problem-solving capabilities just sitting around doing nothing for 190,000 years. Evolution doesn't create expensive organs like big brains unless they're being used. Our ancestors' brains were burning through 20% of their caloric intake every day, just like ours do. They had to be doing something with all that processing power. So what counts as advanced? What counts as sophisticated? We need to separate two concepts that usually get tangled together: civilization versus technological trace. Civilization is about social complexity, accumulated knowledge, sophisticated understanding of the world. Technological trace is what survives for archaeologists to find. These aren't the same thing. You can have one without the other. Consider astronomy. When we think of ancient astronomical knowledge, we usually picture stone observatories like Stonehenge, or written records like Babylonian star catalogues. But the knowledge itself, The actual understanding of celestial mechanics doesn't require any of that. It just requires time, careful observation, and oral tradition. And here's where things get weird. Multiple ancient cultures demonstrated astronomical knowledge that seems impossible for their supposed level of development. The Dogon people of Mali had detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star that's completely invisible to the naked eye and wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until 1862. How did they know about it? They say their ancestors told them. Ancient Egyptian architects aligned the pyramids of Giza to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree. To achieve that, they needed to understand the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. How could you discover that unless you'd been observing and recording the positions of stars for thousands of years before you built the pyramids? Hindu and Mayan calendars both incorporated extremely precise measurements of planetary cycles. The Mayans calculated the length of the solar year to 365,2420 days. The modern measurement is 365,2422 days. They were off by 17 seconds per year. Without telescopes, without computers, without supposedly any advanced mathematical tools, these cultures weren't just lucky guesses. They had systematic, multi-generational observation programs that must have stretched back thousands of years before they ever carved anything in stone. Somebody was watching the skies, tracking patterns, passing down knowledge, refining calculations, generation after generation after generation. Then there's the Antikythera mechanism. This one object, recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek coast in 1901, completely destroyed our assumptions about ancient technological capability. It's a bronze mechanical computer built around 100 BCE with dozens of precisely cut gears that could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, calculate eclipses, and even track the Olympic Games cycle. When it was first X-rayed, scientists couldn't believe what they were seeing. The gearwork was so sophisticated, so precisely engineered, that nothing comparable exists in the historical record until mechanical clocks appeared in medieval Europe, 1,300 years later. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The ancient Greeks weren't supposed to have this kind of precision engineering capability, but they did. Which means our timeline of technological development is wrong. If the Greeks could build this in 100 BCE, what were they building in 1000 BCE? In 3000 BCE? And what did the Greeks inherit from cultures that came before them? The mechanism proves something crucial. Advanced knowledge doesn't always scale up to obvious monuments. It can exist in portable objects, in technical knowledge passed between master craftsmen, in scientific understanding that gets applied to navigation or astronomy or medicine, without ever getting carved into a temple wall. Now let's talk about building. We assume ancient people needed metal tools to create sophisticated structures, but that assumption is based on how we would do it, not on what's actually possible. Experiments have shown that massive stone blocks can be moved using only wooden rollers, ropes, and human labour. Limestone can be cut with copper tools, or even with sand and water used as an abrasive. Harder stones like granite can be shaped with stone tools and patience. More importantly, there are building techniques that leave almost no trace. Earth architecture, rammed earth walls, wooden structures, living architecture where you shape growing trees into buildings. These methods can create sophisticated, permanent structures that will completely vanish within a few thousand years, leaving nothing but unexplained earthworks or mysterious mounds that archaeologists dismiss as natural formations. The Göbekli Tepe complex in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, forced archaeologists to completely revise their timelines. Here were hunter-gatherers, people without agriculture or cities or metallurgy, somehow organising the labour to move and carve 20-ton stone pillars decorated with sophisticated artistic reliefs. They weren't supposed to be capable of this. The textbook said monument building required civilization. But these people built monuments first, possibly for thousands of years before they even invented farming. What if that pattern is older than we think? What if there were other Göbekli Tepes, built not with stone but with wood or earth, that have simply returned to forest? Then there's the knowledge preservation problem. We assume that without writing, complex information can't be maintained across generations, but that's demonstrably false. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintain detailed knowledge of landscapes, water sources and survival techniques for at least 65,000 years, all through oral tradition. Some of their stories contain verifiable references to coastal features that have been underwater for 10,000 years. Oral tradition isn't just storytelling, it's a sophisticated information storage technology. Trained memory specialists in oral cultures can maintain thousands of pieces of interconnected information with perfect accuracy. Native American knowledge keepers could recite tribal histories covering hundreds of years. Polynesian navigators memorized wave patterns, star positions, and island locations across millions of square miles of ocean. Mathematical knowledge can be encoded in stories, in rhythms, in patterns that don't require writing to preserve. The positions of stars can be taught through dance. Engineering principles can be embedded in craft traditions. Medical knowledge can survive in recipes and rituals that look like superstition, but contain genuine therapeutic value. We're talking about humans with your brain. Not smaller brains, not different brains. The same neurological hardware you're using to read this. A person from 50,000 years ago, raised in our society, would be indistinguishable from anyone else. They'd learn to read, do calculus, program computers, because they had the same cognitive capacity we do. So why do we assume they were primitive? Because they didn't build cities, because they didn't smelt iron. Those are choices about what to do with intelligence, not measures of intelligence itself. A culture that chooses to live in small mobile groups, minimizing environmental impact, maintaining perfect harmony with their ecosystem, is that primitive? Or is that possibly more sophisticated than what we're doing? Consider this scenario. Imagine a culture that achieved genuine wisdom, not just technological advancement, but actual understanding of ecological balance, sustainable population levels, long-term thinking. They might deliberately choose to leave no monuments. They might actively avoid creating anything that would last beyond their immediate needs. Not because they couldn't build pyramids, but because they understood that permanent structures are often permanent mistakes. Such a culture could be functionally invisible to archaeology. They'd use wood, fibre, leather, materials that decompose. They'd maintain their knowledge through oral tradition and practical apprenticeship. They'd develop sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and ecology, all without writing a single word or cutting a single stone. From our perspective, looking back through the distorting lens of deep time, they'd appear to be simple hunter-gatherers, but they might have been more advanced than us in the ways that actually matter, more advanced in wisdom, even if less advanced in technology. This isn't fantasy. This is possibility based on human cognitive capacity and the archaeological evidence we actually have. We know humans were anatomically modern for 200,000 years. We know oral traditions can preserve complex information for tens of thousands of years. We know sophisticated astronomical knowledge and precision engineering existed in supposedly primitive eras. We know that most materials humans work with don't survive more than a few thousand years in the archaeological record. Put all that together, and the picture that emerges is unsettling. For the vast majority of human existence, we simply don't know what people were capable of. We don't know what they understood. We don't know what they built with materials that don't preserve. We don't know what knowledge they accumulated and then lost when their oral traditions were broken by climate disasters or population collapses. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's just absence. And in the vastness of deep time, absence is the default state. Everything vanishes eventually. Wood rots, fibre decomposes, even stone erodes. Knowledge encoded in stories dies when the storytellers die. Technical expertise disappears when there's no one left to apprentice. What we're left with is a handful of tantalizing clues, astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet, precision mechanisms that appear centuries before they should, building projects that require organizations supposedly beyond the capacity of their builders, and underneath it all, the undeniable fact of 200,000 years of human cognitive capacity that must have been doing something more than just waiting around for the agricultural revolution. Maybe there weren't earlier civilizations. Maybe the standard timeline is basically correct, and humans really did spend 95% of their existence as cognitively modern beings without developing complex culture. But maybe that assumption tells us more about the limits of our imagination than it does about the limits of our ancestors' capabilities. Maybe we're missing something big, something that's been erased by time and our own assumptions about what advancement looks like. Because here's the thing that should haunt anyone thinking seriously about this question. The evidence of sophistication keeps appearing in places it shouldn't, in eras it shouldn't, among people who supposedly couldn't have achieved it. And every time it appears, we have to revise our timelines backward, making room for complexity earlier and earlier in human history. How far back does it actually go? That's the question we're still trying to answer. Let's talk about things that shouldn't exist. Not ghosts or UFOs, but physical objects. Archaeological artifacts sitting in museums right now that don't quite fit the timeline we've constructed for human technological development. Objects that make archaeologists uncomfortable. Things that whisper about knowledge we supposedly didn't have yet. The Baghdad battery is a good place to start. Discovered in 1936 in a Parthian settlement near modern-day Baghdad, it's a clay jar about 5 inches tall. Inside, a copper cylinder surrounds an iron rod. The whole assembly is sealed with asphalt. On its own, it's just pottery. But here's the thing, if you fill that jar with an acidic liquid, vinegar or wine, it produces about 1.5 volts of electricity. It's a battery, a functioning electrochemical cell, from around 200 BCE. Now, the mainstream explanation is that it was used for electroplating, coating objects with thin layers of gold or silver. That's plausible. Ancient goldsmiths could have stumbled onto electrochemistry without understanding the underlying physics. But here's what makes it interesting. Nobody has found any electroplated objects from that period in that region. No instruction texts, no other batteries, just this one jar and a few similar ones, all sitting in museums producing voltage with no clear explanation for why anyone would have built them. Maybe it was for electroplating, maybe it was for medicine, some kind of primitive electrical therapy, or maybe, just maybe, it was the last surviving example of a technology that was once more widespread. The thing about artifacts is that they only survive when conditions are exactly right. Dry climates, protective burials, lucky accidents. For every object we find, thousands more have rotted, rusted, or been melted down for scrap. What if the Baghdad battery isn't anomalous because it's unique, but because it's the only one that survived? But batteries are one thing, stone is another. Stone lasts. Stone preserves evidence. And some of the stonework from the ancient world is genuinely baffling. Take the megalithic sites scattered across the globe. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Baalbek in Lebanon, the Osirian in Egypt. These aren't just big stones stacked impressively. These are precision-cut blocks weighing dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons, fitted together so tightly you can't slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar, no gaps. Just stone touching stone with tolerances that would make a modern machinist nervous. At Sacsayhuaman, some blocks weigh over 200 tons. They're cut at complex angles, interlocking in 3 dimensions like a puzzle. The surfaces are smooth, the corners are crisp, and they've survived earthquakes that destroyed everything built around them. Modern engineers have tried to replicate this stonework using ancient techniques. Copper tools, stone hammers, wooden, rollers. The results are not impressive. Rough surfaces, uneven edges, nothing approaching the precision of the originals. The standard explanation is that ancient people had lots of time and lots of labour. Given enough workers and enough years, you can accomplish impressive things with primitive tools. That's true, but it doesn't quite explain the precision. Because precision isn't about effort, it's about measurement. To cut stones that fit together perfectly, you need accurate measuring tools, standardized units, quality control. You need the organizational capacity to ensure that the stone being cut on one side of the quarry will mate perfectly with the stone being shaped on the other side. That requires mathematical sophistication and project management skills that supposedly didn't exist yet. Unless they did, unless we've underestimated the intellectual capabilities of these ancient civilizations, or unless they inherited knowledge from someone who came before. Then there's Pumapunku in Bolivia, a site that makes archaeologists genuinely uncomfortable. The stones there aren't just precisely cut, they're standardized. Blocks with H-shaped grooves, all identical within millimeters. Flat surfaces accurate to fractions of a degree. Internal angles of exactly 90 degrees. This isn't artistic stonework. This is industrial manufacturing. These stones look like they came out of a factory. The site dates to around 536 CE, give or take a few decades. The civilization that built it, the Tiwanaku, supposedly worked with stone and bronze tools. No iron, definitely no steel. Yet somehow they produce stonework that exhibits precision typically associated with machine tools. Modern stonemasons looking at Pumapunku often say the same thing. This looks like it was done with diamond-tipped saws and precision grinding equipment. The academic response is usually that we don't understand their techniques, that they must have had methods we haven't rediscovered. That's probably true, but it's also not really an answer. It's just pushing the mystery back one step. Yes, they had techniques we don't understand. The question is, where did those techniques come from? Did they develop them independently over centuries of experimentation, or did they inherit them from an earlier tradition? Now, let's go to China, the Longyu Caves. Discovered in 1992 when local villagers pumped water out of ponds that had existed for centuries. Beneath the water, they found something nobody expected. A massive complex of man-made caverns carved directly into solid siltstone. 36 caves discovered so far, possibly more that remain flooded. Some of these chambers are enormous. 30 meters deep, thousands of square meters of floor space. The walls are covered in precise parallel grooves, evenly spaced, perfectly consistent. The pillars supporting the roofs are symmetrical and load-bearing, positioned exactly where structural engineering says they should be. Here's the mystery. Nobody knows who carved them. Nobody knows when, though estimates range from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Nobody knows why. There are no inscriptions, no archaeological remains inside, no evidence of habitation, just perfectly excavated chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems and precise geometric designs. The amount of rock removed would be roughly 1 million cubic meters, all carved by hand, all removed somehow, all done with such precision that the chambers have remained stable for millennia. Modern engineers have studied these caves extensively. They're structurally sound, designed with an understanding of load distribution and material stress. Whoever built them understood engineering principles we didn't supposedly formalize until the Renaissance, and they did it all underground, in the dark, with tools that left those characteristic parallel grooves that no one can quite explain. The mainstream theory is that they were used for storage or as military hiding places. Maybe. But you don't need precision engineering for storage. You don't need sophisticated structural analysis to hide supplies. The scale and precision of the Longyu Caves suggests something else, something more important, something we don't understand yet. Now, here's where we need to be careful, because mixed in with genuine mysteries are straight-up hoaxes and misidentifications. The Antikythera mechanism? That's real. A genuine ancient Greek analog computer from around 100 BCE, used for astronomical calculations. It's sophisticated, surprising, and completely legitimate. The crystal skulls? Those are fake. Modern creations sold to museums by clever forgers. The Koso artifact, supposedly a spark plug found in a 500,000-year-old geode. It's from the 1920s, not the Stone Age. The challenge is separating legitimate archaeological puzzles from wishful thinking and deliberate fraud. Just because something seems out of place doesn't mean it is. Sometimes the conventional explanation is correct. The trick is figuring out when it isn't. Take the Piri Reis map from 1513. It's a genuine historical document, kept in the library of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. It shows the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America. Nothing unusual there. But some researchers claim it shows the coast of Antarctica. Not the ice-covered Antarctica we know, but the actual landmass beneath the ice. The implication being that whoever provided the source information for this map saw Antarctica before it was covered by ice, before the last ice age. That would require either ancient seafaring civilizations with advanced navigation capabilities, or cartographic knowledge passed down from before the ice sheets formed. The problem is, the coast in question probably isn't Antarctica at all. It's more likely an exaggerated version of South America's eastern coast, drawn by someone working from incomplete information. Most serious cartographers dismiss the Antarctica connection. But here's what's interesting. The map does show longitude calculations. Lines of longitude. In 1513, this is decades before European navigators supposedly figured out how to calculate longitude accurately at sea. The chronometer, the tool that made longitude calculation practical, wasn't invented until 1761. That's 250 years later. So how did the sources for the Piri Reis map know longitude? Maybe they didn't. Maybe the lines are decorative or represent something else. Or maybe, just maybe, someone before the age of exploration had figured out navigation techniques that were later lost and had to be reinvented. Then there's the Saqqara bird, a small wooden object from ancient Egypt, carved around 200 BCE. It has a body, wings, and a tail. Looks like a bird, hence the name. Except the tail is vertical, like a rudder. The wings have a slight dihedral angle, tilted up from the body. Some aviation enthusiasts have looked at this object and said that's not a bird, that's a glider, that's a model airplane. They've built replicas, some of them actually fly. Not well, but they glide. Add a small weight to the nose, throw it like a javelin, and it sails through the air. Does this mean ancient Egyptians understood aerodynamics? That they built flying machines? Probably not. The Saqqara bird doesn't have any control surfaces, no way to steer. It's almost certainly a child's toy or decorative object shaped vaguely like a bird. But the fact that it has aerodynamic properties at all is interesting, suggestive. Not evidence of ancient aviation, but a reminder that people 2,000 years ago were clever and observant. They watched birds, they experimented with shapes and materials, they knew more about physics than we sometimes give them credit for. The real question isn't whether any single artifact proves ancient civilizations had advanced technology. The question is why the scientific establishment resists even entertaining the possibility. Some of this resistance is justified. Academic careers are built on careful research and peer review. You don't throw out decades of established chronology because of one weird artifact. That's good science. Skepticism is healthy. But some of the resistance isn't about science. It's about territory, about protecting established narratives. Archaeology has a history of dismissing inconvenient evidence. Artifacts that don't fit the accepted timeline get classified as anomalies and tucked away in storage. Researchers who ask uncomfortable questions find their funding cut, their papers rejected, not because their work is bad, but because it challenges the consensus. The Baghdad battery sits in a museum. The Puma Punku stones are still there in Bolivia, precisely cut and perfectly aligned. The Longyu caves remain unexplained. These aren't fringe claims or conspiracy theories. These are physical objects that exist in the real world. And they're whispering something to us, something about human ingenuity, about knowledge that might have been more widespread than we thought, about the possibility that our ancestors, or whoever came before them, understood more than we've given them credit for. Not aliens, not magic, just humans. Smart, capable, creative humans who might have figured things out earlier than our current timeline allows, who might have reached levels of sophistication that were later lost in the chaos of collapse and catastrophe, who might have left behind just enough evidence to make us wonder. Because here's the thing about artifacts. They're data points, individual pieces of a puzzle we haven't assembled yet. Take any one of them in isolation, and you can usually find a conventional explanation. But look at them together, as a pattern, and something else emerges. A suggestion that the story we've been telling ourselves about human technological development might be incomplete, that there might have been earlier chapters we've forgotten, earlier peaks of achievement that left only scattered traces. The question isn't whether we should accept wild claims about ancient super-civilizations. The question is whether we should remain curious, whether we should keep asking uncomfortable questions, whether we should be willing to revise our timeline when the evidence demands it. Because somewhere beneath the oceans, buried under silt and sediment, there might be answers we haven't found yet. Let's talk about the most obvious place an ancient civilization could be hiding. Not in some remote jungle or buried under desert sands, but right where millions of people would have actually lived. The coastlines. Except there's a problem. Those coastlines don't exist anymore. They're underwater. Way, way underwater. Here's the scale we're talking about. Since the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, sea levels have risen approximately 120 metres. That's almost 400 feet. Picture a 40-storey building. Now imagine the entire building's height worth of ocean water that didn't used to be there. That water had to go somewhere, and where it went was over the continental shelves, drowning vast stretches of land that were once perfectly habitable, often ideal territories for human settlement. This wasn't a gradual, gentle process. Sure, over 20,000 years it averages out to about 6 millimetres per year, but that's not how it happened. Sea level rise came in pulses, catastrophic flooding events separated by periods of relative stability. Sometimes the ocean would surge forward dozens of metres in just a few centuries. Entire coastlines would be swallowed within a handful of generations, long enough that people would remember the old lands, would tell stories about them, but fast enough that nothing could be saved, nothing could be moved to higher ground. Think about where humans prefer to live. Even today, with all our technology and infrastructure, the majority of human population centres are within 100 kilometres of coastlines. We like coasts. They offer multiple food sources, marine resources, fresh water from rivers, fertile alluvial soils. They provide natural highways for transportation and trade. They tend to have moderate climates compared to interior regions. During the ice ages, when so much water was locked up in glaciers, these advantages were even more pronounced. The coastal zones were broader, more diverse, more resource-rich than they are today. If advanced cultures existed during the last ice age, they would have been on those coasts. And now those coasts are 120 metres underwater, buried under millennia of sediment battered by currents and tides, completely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. But we do have proof this happened. We have a confirmed lost civilization zone. It's called Doggerland, and it was a real place where real people lived for thousands of years until the sea swallowed it completely. Doggerland was a landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe across what is now the North Sea. During the last glacial maximum, it was a vast lowland area, probably about the size of modern England. Rivers flowed across it, animals migrated through it, and humans lived there, hunting, gathering, building communities. We know this because fishing trawlers occasionally pull up stone tools, worked bone, and even fragments of human artifacts from the bottom of the North Sea. Archaeological surveys using advanced sonar mapping have revealed the ghost landscape beneath the waves, river valleys, lake beds, hills, coastlines, an entire geography that existed for millennia and then vanished. The final blow came around 8,200 years ago when a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami that swept across what remained of Doggerland. Within hours, any remaining high ground was inundated. Any people who hadn't already retreated to Britain or Europe would have drowned or been forced to flee. Their settlements, their tools, their art, everything they built now lies under 20 to 40 metres of turbulent seawater and mud. Doggerland is proof of concept. It demonstrates conclusively that substantial territories where humans lived for thousands of years can be completely submerged, leaving almost no accessible archaeological record. And Doggerland is just one relatively small area. The total amount of land lost to post-glacial flooding worldwide is staggering. Millions of square kilometres. The entire Persian Gulf was dry land. The Sunda Shelf connecting Indonesia, Malaysia and mainland Southeast Asia was a vast subcontinent. The land bridge across the Bering Strait was hundreds of kilometres wide, all of it gone, underwater, and we've barely looked. But we have looked in a few places, and what we've found is extremely controversial. Take the structures off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan. In 1987, a dive tour operator discovered a series of massive stone formations on the seabed near Yonaguni Island. These aren't just random rocks. We're talking about stepped platforms, flat terraces, right-angle corners, what appear to be carved channels and basins. The main structure rises about 25 metres from the seafloor and features parallel stone blocks, straight walls, and geometric angles that look disturbingly artificial. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has spent decades studying the site. He argues these are the remains of a human settlement, possibly dating back 10,000 years or more, based on the sea level at the time they would have been on dry land. He points to what he interprets as tool marks, carved symbols, even a crude face sculpted into the rock. Other researchers aren't convinced. They argue the formation is entirely natural, the result of geological processes that can create seemingly geometric shapes through natural fracturing and erosion. Sandstone, they point out, can split along planes that create flat surfaces and right angles without any human intervention. The debate has raged for decades. Nobody disputes that the structure is real and remarkable. The question is whether it's remarkable geology or remarkable archaeology. Here's the thing, though. We don't have to choose. Even if the Yonaguni formation is entirely natural, the presence of what appear to be carved markings suggests humans at least modified and used these structures, even if they didn't create them. And the fact that this massive formation is now deep underwater, yet shows possible evidence of human interaction, proves that our ancestors were operating in environments that are completely inaccessible to surface archaeology. Then there's Dwarka, off the coast of Gujarat, India. This one's different because we're not guessing about whether a city existed there. Ancient Indian texts explicitly describe Dwarka, the legendary city of Lord Krishna, as a major urban centre that was eventually submerged by the sea. For centuries, these texts were treated as pure mythology. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, marine archaeological surveys found actual structural remains on the seabed in the Gulf of Cambay, exactly where the text said Dwarka should be. The discoveries include massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, arranged in geometric patterns, grid-like foundations, pottery fragments, sections of what appear to be walls and defensive structures. Acoustic surveys have revealed even more extensive formations buried under sediment. Some researchers have dated organic material from the site to around 9,000 years ago, though these dates are hotly contested. What's not contested is that there are definitely human structures underwater off Gujarat's coast, structures that would have been built when sea levels were lower and the coastline extended much further out. Dwarka demonstrates something crucial. Ancient texts describing sunken cities aren't necessarily pure fantasy. Sometimes they're cultural memory of real events, and if one legendary sunken city turned out to be real, how many others might be waiting to be discovered? The Mediterranean has its own collection of underwater mysteries, structures off the coast of Alexandria, submerged ruins near Sicily, the controversial formations near the islands of Malta and Gozo, that some researchers claim show evidence of megalithic construction now lying under 20 metres of water. Off the coast of Lebanon, divers have documented what appear to be quarried stone blocks and carved features on underwater rock formations. Some argue these are remnants of prehistoric coastal settlements. Others maintain their geological features being misinterpreted by enthusiastic amateur archaeologists. The pattern is clear. We keep finding things underwater that we didn't expect and can't fully explain. Some turn out to be natural, some turn out to be archaeological remains from known historical periods. But some remain ambiguous, puzzling, suggestive of human activity in places and times that don't fit conventional chronologies. The real issue is that we've barely begun to look. Here's a number that should shock you. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been mapped in detail, comparable to what we have for the land surface. Most of the seafloor is known only from satellite altimetry, which can detect large-scale features but misses everything smaller than about 5 kilometres. The continental shelves, where post-glacial settlements would be located, are better mapped than the deep ocean, but we're still talking about vast areas that have never been systematically surveyed with high-resolution equipment. Think about what this means. We've located thousands of archaeological sites on land through aerial surveys, satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar. We've found ancient cities buried under jungle, roads hidden beneath farmland, entire settlement networks invisible to surface observation. Now imagine trying to do the same work 30 metres underwater, in currents, with limited visibility, where everything is covered by sediment and organic growth. The technical challenges are enormous, the costs are prohibitive, and the institutional support for underwater archaeology focused on prehistoric periods is minimal. Most marine archaeological work focuses on historically documented sites, shipwrecks, known ancient harbours, submerged structures from classical civilizations. The idea of systematically searching continental shells for evidence of prehistoric coastal settlements that might predate known civilizations by thousands of years. That's not even on the research agenda for most institutions. There's no funding for it, limited academic interest, and significant skepticism about whether anything would be found. But technology is changing the equation. Multibeam sonar systems can now map large areas of seafloor in extraordinary detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles can conduct systematic surveys without requiring human divers. Synthetic aperture sonar can penetrate sediment to reveal buried structures. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras can investigate promising sites without the time and depth limitations of human divers. As these technologies become more affordable and more widely available, the systematic exploration of submerged continental shelves becomes feasible in a way it never was before. And when that exploration happens, when we finally start seriously looking at the millions of square kilometres of formerly dry land that now lies underwater, we might discover something that completely changes our understanding of human history. Maybe we'll find nothing but scattered stone tools and the remains of small hunter-gatherer camps. That would be the conservative outcome, confirming that coastal populations during the Ice Ages were living much like contemporary inland groups. Or maybe we'll find something else. Concentrations of structures suggesting permanent settlements, evidence of maritime adaptation and seafaring capabilities earlier than currently believed, signs of social complexity and technological sophistication in populations that supposedly weren't capable of those achievements. Or perhaps, in some particularly favourable location, evidence of something that pushes back the timeline of civilization by thousands of years. The ocean is keeping secrets. That's not speculation, it's geographic fact. Vast territories where humans lived are now completely submerged and almost entirely unexplored. Whatever was there, whoever lived there, whatever they built, it's all still down there, waiting. Waiting for the technology to find it, waiting for researchers willing to look, waiting for the day when we finally decide that the world's continental shelves are as worthy of archaeological investigation as its deserts and jungles. Until then, we're making judgments about human prehistory based on an incomplete data set. We're drawing conclusions about our ancestors' capabilities while ignoring the environments where they most likely would have thrived. We're writing history without examining the places where history was most densely written. The underwater secret isn't that lost civilizations definitely exist beneath the waves. The secret is that we haven't really looked, and until we do, we won't know what we're missing. Let's talk about the greatest historical cover-up that nobody actually intended to commit. For centuries, we've been told a very specific story about the Americas before European contact. The narrative goes something like this. Scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers living simple lives in a pristine wilderness. Untouched forests stretching from coast to coast. A few small agricultural settlements here and there, but nothing remotely comparable to the great civilizations of Egypt, Rome, or China. The Americas, according to this story, were basically empty, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be civilized. There's just one problem with this story. It's almost completely wrong. And we're only figuring this out now because of a technology that lets us see through trees. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, sends laser pulses from aircraft that can penetrate forest canopy and map the ground beneath. Archaeologists started using it in the Amazon rainforest about 15 years ago, mostly hoping to find a few interesting sites. What they found instead changed everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian America. Underneath the trees, invisible from the ground, invisible from satellite imagery, there are cities. Not small settlements, cities. Massive geometric earthworks, raised causeways stretching for miles. Agricultural systems so sophisticated they put modern farming to shame. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, evidence of human modification of the landscape on a scale that's hard to comprehend. One site in Bolivia revealed urban complexes covering more than 1,500 square miles. That's larger than the state of Rhode Island. Interconnected settlements, each with its own ceremonial centres, residential areas, and agricultural infrastructure. All of it hidden under forest that we'd assumed was primeval, untouched by human hands. In Brazil, they found geoglyphs, massive geometric shapes carved into the earth, some of them over 1,000 feet across. There are hundreds of them, maybe thousands, built by cultures we don't even have names for. The constructions required moving millions of cubic feet of earth, coordinating labour forces of thousands, maintaining these sites over centuries, and that's just what we've found so far. New discoveries are being announced every few months. Every time they scan a new section of forest, they find more earthworks, more settlements, more evidence of dense populations living in complex societies. But here's the really disturbing part. By the time Europeans actually penetrated deep into these regions, the cities were empty, abandoned, reclaimed by the forest. The Europeans arrived, looked around, saw nothing but trees and a few scattered indigenous groups, and concluded the Americas had always been this empty. They had no idea they were walking through a graveyard, a continental-scale mass grave created by diseases that had arrived ahead of them. When Columbus landed in 1492, he brought something far deadlier than guns or steel, European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, the bubonic plague, diseases that had been circulating in Europe, Asia and Africa for millennia, against which indigenous Americans had zero immunity. The result was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Conservative estimates suggest 90% mortality within a century. Some regions probably saw 95% or higher die-offs, but here's what makes this particularly insidious. The diseases spread faster than the Europeans themselves. Indigenous people had extensive trade networks spanning thousands of miles. A Spanish expedition on the coast could trigger an epidemic that would reach inland populations months before any European ever set foot in their territory. By the time European explorers actually penetrated the interior, they were often encountering the survivors of societies that had already collapsed. Imagine trying to understand European civilization by exploring it, after the Black Death had killed 90% of the population instead of 30%. You'd find empty cities, overgrown fields, survivors living in the ruins with only fragmentary memories of how things used to be. You'd probably conclude Europeans had always lived in small scattered groups. You'd be completely wrong, but you'd have no way to know that. That's essentially what happened in the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors wrote about encountering dense populations along major rivers, settlements stretching for miles, so closely spaced you could travel for days without leaving inhabited territory. But when the next wave of Europeans arrived a generation or two later, those populations had vanished. And because the early accounts seemed so exaggerated compared to what later explorers found, historians dismissed them as fantasy. We're now realizing those early accounts were probably accurate, maybe even understated. The Americas before 1492 weren't empty. They were full. Consider Cahokia, located across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis. Around 1100 AD, Cahokia was the largest city in North America. Its population probably exceeded 20,000, possibly 40,000 if you count the greater metropolitan area. That's larger than London at the same time period. Larger than most European cities wouldn't be until centuries later. The site covers 6 square miles of carefully planned urban architecture. At its centre, Monk's Mound rises 100 feet high and covers 14 acres at its base. It's the largest prehistoric earthen construction in the Americas. Building it required moving more than 22 million cubic feet of earth, all carried in baskets on human backs. The coordinated labour required, the organisational capacity, the social complexity, all of it rivals or exceeds anything happening in Europe at the time. And Cahokia wasn't alone. It was the centre of a civilization that built thousands of earthen mounds across the Mississippi Valley and the southeast. These weren't just burial mounds, though they served that purpose too. They were platform mounds for temples, elite residences and ceremonial structures. They were the skyscrapers of their time, announcing the power and sophistication of the societies that built them. The mound builder cultures created trade networks stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic to the Rockies. Archaeologists find Great Lakes copper in the Florida, Gulf Coast shells in Ohio, obsidian from Wyoming and Illinois. These weren't random exchanges. These were systematic trade routes maintained over centuries, implying political organization, probably tribute systems, possibly even a kind of empire. But by the time European settlers arrived in the Mississippi Valley, Cahokia had been abandoned for 3 centuries. The mounds were overgrown, the trade networks had collapsed, and the scattered indigenous groups living in the region had only vague memories of who had built them. Early American settlers literally couldn't believe indigenous people had constructed these monuments. They invented elaborate theories about lost civilizations, ancient Europeans, even Atlanteans. Anything but acknowledge that the people they were displacing had created complex societies that rivaled their own. We made the same mistake in the Amazon. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists and ecologists believed the Amazon rainforest was a pristine wilderness that couldn't support large populations. The soil was too poor, they said, the environment too challenging. Maybe a few thousand people living as hunter-gatherers, but certainly nothing more. They were wrong about every single assumption. The Amazon absolutely could support large populations. It did support large populations, and the reason we know this is literally beneath our feet. Terra Preta, Amazonian dark earth. These are patches of incredibly fertile black soil found throughout the Amazon basin, sometimes covering hundreds of acres. For a long time, scientists thought they were natural geological formations. Then they started analysing them more carefully. Terra Preta isn't natural, it's manufactured. Ancient Amazonians created it by mixing charcoal, bone, and organic waste with ordinary soil, then maintaining these composting systems for generations. The result is soil that's far more fertile than the surrounding rainforesty earth, and it stays fertile for centuries, maybe millennia. Even today, farmers seek out terra preta sites because the crops grow so much better. These aren't small kitchen gardens we're talking about. Terra preta sites total millions of acres across the Amazon. That's evidence of intensive agriculture supporting dense populations over centuries, possibly millennia. You don't create millions of acres of improved soil unless you have millions of mouths to feed. Recent estimates suggest the Amazon basin might have supported 10 to 15 million people before European contact, maybe more. The population of pre-Columbian Americas overall, conservative estimates now range from 50 to 70 million. Some researchers argue for numbers over 100 million. To put that in perspective, Europe in 1492 had roughly 60 to 70 million people. The Americas weren't sparsely populated. They were full as Europe, maybe fuller in some regions, and they weren't just full of people living in small scattered bands. They were full of people actively managing the landscape on a continental scale, that pristine wilderness European settlers thought they were encountering. It was a garden, a massive, sophisticated, deliberately maintained garden that had been cultivated for thousands of years. Indigenous Americans practiced controlled burning to maintain grasslands and prevent catastrophic wildfires. They selectively planted fruit and nut trees throughout forests, essentially creating food forests that looked natural but were actually carefully curated. They modified river courses, built massive fish weirs, created raised agricultural fields in wetlands. Everywhere archaeologists look, they find evidence of human landscape management. The great eastern forests of North America, they were managed. The abundance of deer and elk that early settlers marveled at, that was maintained through careful habitat management. The incredible diversity of food plants found in the Amazon. Many of them were selectively bred and distributed by indigenous peoples. When 90% of this population died in the century after Columbus, the landscape itself transformed. Without constant human management, forests reclaimed agricultural land. Animal populations exploded or crashed without human predation and habitat maintenance. The Americas Europeans explored in the 1600s and 1700s were in the middle of rewilding after the greatest human die-off in history. They were looking at a post-apocalyptic landscape and thinking it was pristine wilderness. They were walking through a collapsed civilization and thinking they'd found empty Eden. We're still discovering the scale of what was lost. Every year brings new LiDAR surveys, new excavations, new revelations. In 2020, researchers announced the discovery of a 12-mile-long ceremonial complex in Brazil that predates Stonehenge. In 2022, they found evidence of urban settlements in the Bolivian Amazon that thrived continuously from 500 AD to 1400 AD, then vanished within a generation. The technology keeps improving. Ground-penetrating radar can now reveal structures without excavation. Satellite analysis of soil chemistry can identify ancient settlement patterns invisible to the naked eye. Genetic analysis of modern plant distributions reveals how indigenous peoples shaped forest composition. Each new discovery forces us to revise our estimates upward. Bigger populations, more complex societies, longer histories, greater environmental impact. The Americas before Columbus weren't waiting to be civilized. They were already civilized, differently than Europe or Asia, certainly, but just as sophisticated in their own ways. And this matters, not just for historical accuracy, though that's important. It matters because it fundamentally changes how we think about human societies, environmental management, and what's possible. Indigenous Americans managed continental-scale ecosystems sustainably for thousands of years. They built cities that housed tens of thousands without industrial technology. They created agricultural systems that improved soil rather than depleting it. They maintained trade networks and political organizations spanning thousands of miles without written language or wheeled vehicles. They did all this, and then they vanished so completely that we forgot they ever existed. Hidden in plain sight under trees and soil, waiting for us to develop technology good enough to see them again. Makes you wonder what else we might be missing. Here's something that should make you angry. For over a century, professional archaeologists looked at some of the most magnificent stone architecture in the world and decided it was physically impossible that Africans could have built it. Not unlikely, not improbable, impossible. This wasn't just ignorance, this was systematic erasure, and it's created blind spots in our understanding of human history that we're only now beginning to correct. Let me tell you about Great Zimbabwe. Picture this: massive stone walls, some 36 feet high and 20 feet thick, constructed without mortar, towers reaching toward the sky, a city that at its peak housed maybe 18,000 people, with sophisticated water management systems, evidence of long-distance trade networks, an architectural sophistication that rivals anything being built in medieval Europe. The ruins cover almost 1,800 acres. You can't miss them. They've been standing there in southeastern Africa for 600 years, impossible to overlook, undeniable in their magnificence. When European colonizers first encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 1800s, they were faced with a problem. The structures were too sophisticated, too well engineered, too impressive to fit their narrative about African civilization, so they made up stories instead. They decided it must have been built by Phoenicians, or maybe the Queen of Sheba, or perhaps some lost white civilization that had vanished centuries before. German explorer Karl Mauch actually claimed the buildings were constructed by the biblical Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, despite the fact that radiocarbon dating would later prove they were built by the Shona people between the 11th and 15th centuries. But here's where it gets darker. When professional archaeologists finally began studying the site, some of them deliberately destroyed evidence that contradicted the lost white civilization narrative. J. Theodore Bent, working in the 1890s, selectively removed artifacts and conveniently lost documentation that would have proved indigenous African construction. Later, in the early 1900s, the Ancient Ruins Company of Rhodesia literally looted the site, carrying off tons of artifacts to sell to collectors, destroying stratigraphic evidence in the process. It wasn't until the 1930s that professional archaeologists began acknowledging what should have been obvious from the start. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, Shona people specifically. And it wasn't some isolated miracle. It was the largest of hundreds of similar stone complexes scattered across the region, all built using the same techniques, all connected by trade networks that stretch from the interior to the Indian Ocean coast. But the damage was done. Decades of colonial propaganda had created a blind spot that persists even today. Ask 100 people to name ancient civilizations, and maybe 3 will mention Great Zimbabwe. The others will list Egypt, Greece, Rome, Maya, China. The systematic dismissal of African achievement by colonial-era archaeologists successfully erased an entire civilization from popular consciousness. And Great Zimbabwe wasn't even close to being alone. Let me tell you about the Nok culture. Starting around 1000 BCE in what's now Nigeria, the Nok people were creating terracotta sculptures of such sophistication that when European archaeologists first encountered them in the 1940s, many refused to believe they were ancient. The sculptures show incredible artistic skill. Naturalistic human figures with elaborate hairstyles and jewellery, animals captured in motion, evidence of a complex society with specialised craftspeople and artistic traditions. But here's what makes the Nok really special. They were smelting iron, high-quality iron. While much of Europe was still in the Bronze Age, the Nok had mastered iron-smelting technology that wouldn't reach some parts of the Mediterranean for another 500 years. They were creating steel tools and weapons using techniques we're still trying to fully understand. Some researchers think they might have independently invented iron smelting, developing the technology without any outside influence. The Nok culture persisted for over 1,500 years. They had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex social hierarchies, long-distance trade networks. They influenced cultures across West Africa. Yet most people have never heard of them. They're not taught in schools. They don't appear in popular history books. They've been systematically ignored because they don't fit the narrative that technological innovation flowed from Europe and the Middle East to everywhere else. Now, let's talk about Nubia and Kush. These civilizations didn't just exist alongside ancient Egypt, they conquered it. The Kushite 25th dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly a century, from around 747 to 656 BCE. Kushite pharaohs controlled one of the most powerful empires in the world. They built more pyramids than the Egyptians did, over 200 of them, though most people couldn't name a single one. They developed their own writing system, Meroitic script, which we still haven't fully deciphered. They were master archers, their skill so renowned that ancient texts referred to Nubia as the land of the bow. They had complex metallurgy, creating weapons and tools that were traded across the ancient world. The city of Meroe, the Kushite capital from around 300 BCE, was a major industrial centre. Recent archaeological work has revealed massive slag heaps, evidence of iron production on an almost industrial scale. They were manufacturing iron tools and weapons for export across Africa and beyond. This was sophisticated metallurgy, temperature control, alloying techniques that required deep understanding of chemistry and material science. But when's the last time you saw a documentary about Kushite civilization? When did you read about it in school? The Kushites conquered Egypt, one of the most studied civilizations in human history, yet somehow they remain invisible in popular consciousness. Colonial-era Egyptologists were so focused on linking Egypt to European and Middle Eastern civilizations that they systematically downplayed or ignored the African kingdoms to the south, even when those kingdoms were literally ruling Egypt. Then there's West Africa. While Europe was stumbling through the early Middle Ages, the Empire of Ghana was accumulating wealth that would make modern billionaires jealous. By the 9th century CE, Ghana controlled the gold and salt trade across the Sahara. The king's treasury was said to hold nuggets of gold so large they had to be kept staked to the ground to prevent theft. When the Empire of Ghana declined, it was replaced by Mali, then Songhai. These weren't primitive kingdoms. These were sophisticated states with complex bureaucracies, standing armies, and centres of learning that rivaled anything in Europe. Timbuktu in the Mali Empire became one of the great intellectual centres of the medieval world. The University of Sankore, established in the 14th century, had one of the largest libraries in the world. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covered mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and philosophy. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study there. Mansa Musa, Mali's most famous emperor, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that was so lavish he literally crashed the gold market in Egypt. He brought 60,000 people with him, including 12,000 slaves, and gave away so much gold that it caused inflation that lasted a decade. Yet how many people learn about Mansa Musa in school? How many can name a single university in medieval Africa? The West African empires controlled territories larger than Western Europe, had populations in the millions, developed complex legal systems and urban planning. But colonial narratives dismissed them as primitive, and that dismissal became embedded in how history was taught for generations. The tragedy is that we're still discovering just how much we've missed. Recent archaeological work is revealing sophisticated societies across Africa that were completely unknown to Western scholarship. In the forests of Central Africa, LIDAR surveys are detecting earthworks and settlement patterns that suggest complex civilizations we never knew existed. In the Sahara, satellite imagery is revealing ancient cities buried under sand, evidence of thriving cultures that disappeared when the climate changed. There's the kingdom of Mapungubwe in southern Africa, which predated Great Zimbabwe and was equally sophisticated. There's the city of Gedi in Kenya, a mysterious stone city abandoned in the 17th century for reasons we still don't understand. There's evidence of complex societies in the Niger River Delta going back thousands of years, barely studied because colonial-era archaeologists decided the region wasn't worth investigating. The blind spots created by racial bias in archaeology are massive. For decades, African sites were systematically under-excavated, underfunded and underpublished. When sites were investigated, they were often interpreted through racist frameworks that assumed any sophistication must have come from outside Africa. Trade goods from India or China were presented as evidence of foreign construction rather than evidence of African trade networks. Complex engineering was attributed to mysterious lost civilizations rather than to the Africans who actually built the structures. We're correcting this now, but slowly. African archaeologists are leading new investigations of sites that were previously dismissed or ignored. New technologies like LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar are revealing buried cities and structures that traditional archaeological methods missed. Genetic analysis is showing that African populations were far more connected and mobile than are previously believed, trading and interacting across vast distances. But here's what keeps me up at night. How much have we already lost? African archaeology is desperately underfunded compared to work in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. Sites are being destroyed by development, looted by artifact hunters, damaged by climate change and conflict. The rainforests of Central Africa might conceal civilizations we'll never find because the jungle has reclaimed them and they're being cleared for agriculture before archaeologists can survey them. The expanding Sahara is burying sites under sand faster than we can excavate them. There's a clock ticking. Every year we lose more potential evidence of Africa's hidden history. Ancient manuscripts in Timbuktu are deteriorating. Stone structures are crumbling without conservation. Oral histories are being lost as elders pass away without their knowledge being recorded. And the thing is, we know Africa was the crucible of human evolution. Every innovation that makes us human, language, tool use, symbolic thinking, complex social organization, all of it emerged in Africa first. It makes zero sense that Africans would then stop innovating for thousands of years while the rest of the world built civilizations. The absence of African civilizations in our historical narrative isn't evidence that they didn't exist. It's evidence that we didn't look, or that when we did look, we refused to see what was right in front of us. The real question isn't whether sophisticated civilizations existed in Africa. We know they did. The question is, how many more are still out there, waiting to be discovered or rediscovered? How many kingdoms rose and fell in the interior regions where archaeology has barely scratched the surface? What's buried under the jungles, the deserts, the expanding cities? And here's the uncomfortable truth. The systematic dismissal of African history wasn't just about racism, it was strategic. If you're justifying colonization, you need to believe that the people you're colonizing are primitive, incapable of sophisticated civilization. Acknowledging Great Zimbabwe, or the University of Sankore or the Kushite conquest of Egypt would undermine the entire colonial project. So those histories were erased, systematically and deliberately. We're living with the consequences of that erasure. The blind spots it created in our understanding of human history are massive, and we won't fully correct them until African archaeology gets the resources, attention, and respect it deserves. Until then, we're missing huge pieces of the human story. Entire civilizations are invisible to us, not because they didn't exist, but because we chose not to see them. Now, we're going to get really strange. Strange enough that some scientists hesitated before even publishing the paper. But sometimes the most important questions are the ones that sound crazy at first. In 2018, two respected scientists, Gavin Schmidt from NASA's Goddard Institute and Adam Frank from the University of Rochester, asked a question that changed how we think about deep time and the limits of knowledge. The question was simple, terrifyingly simple. How would we actually know if there had been an industrial civilization on Earth millions of years before humans existed? They called it the Silurian Hypothesis, named after a Doctor Who episode where intelligent reptiles evolved long before humans. It's not a claim that ancient civilizations existed. It's something more unsettling. It's a thought experiment about the limits of what we can detect, about how thoroughly time erases evidence of existence, and the answer they came to should keep you awake at night. Here's the setup. Imagine an industrial civilization rose on Earth not 10,000 years ago, not 100,000, but 50 million years ago. Maybe 100 million. Long before humans, long before anything we'd recognize as our evolutionary ancestors. They built cities, developed technology, extracted resources, changed their environment. Then, like 99.9% of all species that have ever lived, they went extinct. Now, in 2024, how much evidence of their existence would remain? The answer, and this is what made the paper so striking, is almost nothing. Maybe nothing at all. Let's start with the obvious stuff. Cities, buildings, infrastructure. The pyramids have stood for 4,500 years and they're already eroding. The Great Wall of China is crumbling after just 2,000 years. Modern concrete, the stuff we build everything from, degrades completely in perhaps 1,000 years when not maintained. Steel rusts, glass breaks down. Plastics, which we think of as nearly permanent, actually degrade under ultraviolet light, breaking into smaller and smaller pieces until they're molecularly dispersed. Within 10,000 years, most surface structures would be gone. Within 100,000 years, even the foundations would be weathered away or buried under sediment. Within 1,000,000 years, continental drift, erosion, and geological processes would have recycled nearly everything, and we're talking about timescales of 50–100 million years. That's long enough for entire mountain ranges to rise and erode away, long enough for continents to drift thousands of miles, long enough for the Earth's surface to be completely remodeled multiple times over. Everything on the surface would be gone, completely, not reduced to ruins, not buried under sediment, actually molecularly dispersed and recycled through geological processes. But what about fossils? Surely if an entire civilization existed, we'd find their bones, right? Here's the problem. Fossilization is incredibly rare. The vast majority of living things that die don't fossilize. They decompose completely, returning their atoms to the environment without leaving any trace. For something to fossilize, you need very specific conditions. Rapid burial in sediment, usually underwater, low oxygen environments that prevent decay. The right chemical conditions for minerals to replace organic material. And then the fossil has to survive millions of years without being destroyed by heat, pressure, or erosion. What percentage of organisms actually fossilize? Estimates vary, but it's something like 1 in a billion, maybe less. We have found approximately 300,000 species in the fossil record. Scientists estimate there have been roughly 5 billion species in Earth's history. That means we found fossils of about 0.06% of all species that ever existed. The other 99,94% have vanished without a trace. Now consider humans specifically. Our entire species has existed for maybe 300,000 years. In that time, approximately 100 billion individual humans have lived and died. We found skeletal remains of perhaps a few thousand individuals older than 10,000 years. That's 0.03% of all humans who lived before civilization. Everyone else, all those billions of lives, left no physical trace that has survived to our time. If modern humans went extinct tomorrow, and you came back 50 million years from now, you might find 0 human fossils. Not because we didn't exist. Because fossilization is that rare, and the Earth is that good at recycling material. So buildings gone. Fossils statistically unlikely. What about all our stuff? The millions of tons of material we've extracted and processed. All that plastic, all that metal, all those synthetic compounds that don't exist in nature. Surely some of that would survive. Some of it might. But it wouldn't look like anything recognizable. Metals would oxidize and disperse. Plastics would break down into hydrocarbon compounds indistinguishable from natural organic materials. Even our most durable substances would eventually be subducted into the Earth's mantle through plate tectonics, melted down and recycled. What might remain, and this is what Schmidt and Frank focused on, would be subtle chemical signatures, anomalies in the geological record that don't quite fit natural patterns. For example, an industrial civilization would almost certainly burn fossil fuels or use nuclear energy. Both would leave traces. Burning coal and oil releases carbon with a specific isotope ratio. If a civilization burned enough fossil fuels, it might create a layer in the geological record where carbon isotope ratios spike in a particular direction. We'd find a thin layer of sediment, maybe a few centimeters thick, representing thousands of years of industrialization, where the chemistry is just slightly off. Nuclear energy would leave traces of synthetic elements or unusual isotope ratios of natural elements. The half-lives of most radioactive isotopes are short enough that they decay completely in millions of years, but they might leave daughter products, stable isotopes that formed from radioactive decay in unusual concentrations. A civilization might also mine specific minerals intensively, creating depletion zones in certain areas and concentration zones where they processed or disposed of materials. Millions of years later, you might find geological formations where element distributions don't match what natural processes would create. The problem is, all of these signals would be subtle, ambiguous, easy to explain away as natural variation or unusual geological processes. You'd need to be specifically looking for them, and you'd need to know what to look for. Which brings us to the deeply unsettling part. What if we've already found these anomalies and explained them away as natural? The geological record is full of weird stuff. Layers where chemistry shifts unexpectedly, mineral deposits in strange configurations, isotope ratios that don't quite match our models. Usually we explain these as the result of volcanic activity, or asteroid impacts, or changes in ocean chemistry, or any of a dozen other natural processes. But how would we know the difference between a natural anomaly and the faint trace of a vanished civilization? The honest answer is we probably couldn't. Not definitively, not after 50 or 100 million years. Consider the timescales involved. Mammals first appeared about 225 million years ago. For most of that time, they were small, marginal creatures living in the shadows of dinosaurs. After the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, mammals diversified rapidly. Primates appeared around 55 million years ago. The first apes around 20 million years ago. Humans split from chimpanzees maybe 6 or 7 million years ago. Modern humans appeared only 300,000 years ago. That means for 224.7 million years, there were mammals on Earth, but no humans. That's 750 times longer than humans have existed. If intelligence could evolve in mammals once, why not twice? Why not 3 times? What's special about our particular moment in history that makes us the first and only intelligent species that Earth has produced? Nothing. There's nothing special about right now from a geological perspective. The Earth was perfectly capable of supporting complex life for hundreds of millions of years before humans appeared. If intelligence could evolve in our lineage, it could have evolved in other lineages at other times. Maybe it did. Maybe it did multiple times. And maybe every trace of those species has been so completely erased by geological processes that we'd never know they existed unless we knew exactly what to look for. This is what the Silurian Hypothesis really tells us. Not that ancient civilizations definitely existed, but that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Not on these timescales, not with processes this destructive. The Earth is too good at recycling, time is too long. The preservation of evidence is too rare, and here's what makes this really significant for our investigation of lost human civilizations. If evidence of industrial civilizations could be completely erased in 50 million years, what about pre-industrial civilizations after just 10,000 or 20,000 years? If we'd struggled to detect fossil fuel burning and nuclear technology after millions of years, how would we detect stone construction and agriculture after thousands of years, especially if that civilization existed during periods of lower sea levels on what's now the ocean floor? The Silurian Hypothesis reveals the limits of archaeological and geological knowledge. It shows us that there are hard boundaries on what we can know about the deep past. Some questions might simply be unanswerable, not because we're not smart enough or don't have the right tools, but because the evidence has been destroyed. Methodically, completely, inevitably destroyed by the passage of time and the grinding processes of geology. Scientists emphasize that the Silurian Hypothesis is a thought experiment, not a serious proposal that ancient civilizations existed. The goal wasn't to claim we have missed previous industrial societies. The goal was to think seriously about how we detect our own civilization millions of years in the future, and in doing so, understand what signatures we should look for when searching for life on other planets. If we were paleontologists from another world, visiting Earth 100 million years from now, would we be able to tell that humans had existed? Would we recognize the subtle chemical anomalies as signs of intelligence rather than just weird geology? But the implications go beyond astrobiology. The Silurian Hypothesis forces us to confront how much we don't know, how much we can't know about Earth's history. It reveals that our confidence about the past might be misplaced. That absence of evidence really isn't evidence of absence when you're dealing with timescales this long and processes this destructive. This matters because it changes how we think about anomalies and mysteries in the archaeological record. When we find something that doesn't fit our understanding, something that seems too sophisticated or too old, we have two choices. We can explain it away as misinterpretation or contamination or fraud. Or we can take it seriously as potential evidence that our timeline might be incomplete. The Silurian Hypothesis tells us we should be humble. The Earth has been capable of supporting complex intelligent life for hundreds of millions of years. We've been here for 300,000. That's 0.13% of the time complex life has existed on land. The idea that we're the first and only intelligent species in all that time? That's not a scientific conclusion. That's an assumption. Maybe a reasonable assumption, but still an assumption. And sometimes, reasonable assumptions turn out to be wrong. So here we are. After exploring sunken coastlines, mysterious artifacts, forgotten African kingdoms, and even the possibility of industrial civilizations millions of years before humans existed, what do we actually know? Here's the honest answer. We know that the past is far stranger and more complex than we thought even 20 years ago. We know that civilizations rise and fall, sometimes leaving almost nothing behind. We know that absence of evidence, especially across the vast stretches of deep time, isn't the same thing as evidence of absence. Think about what we've covered. Göbekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago by people we thought were simple hunter-gatherers. Except they weren't simple at all. They were organizing massive construction projects, creating sophisticated art, coordinating hundreds of workers. We only discovered this site in 1994. Before that, every textbook would have told you such complexity was impossible at that time. The submerged coastlines hold cities and settlements we're only beginning to map. Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, vast inhabited landscapes now under hundreds of feet of water. We're finding them now, not because they weren't there before, but because we finally have the technology to look. The Norte Chico civilization in Peru predates the Egyptian pyramids. We discovered it in the 1990s. For centuries, scholars insisted complex civilization couldn't develop in the Americas that early. They were wrong. The African kingdoms we discussed, Great Zimbabwe, the Nok culture, the sophisticated ironworking societies, many of them were dismissed or ignored for decades because they didn't fit the narrative people wanted to believe about African history. Then the evidence became undeniable. Every decade we push human history backwards. Every year we discover our ancestors were more capable, more innovative, more sophisticated than we thought. The pattern is clear. We keep underestimating the past. Now, does this mean ancient aliens built the pyramids? No. Does it mean there was definitely an advanced Ice Age civilization? Not necessarily. Does it prove industrial civilizations existed millions of years ago? Almost certainly not. But it does mean we should stay curious. It means we should demand evidence, yes, but also remain open to evidence that challenges our assumptions. The balance matters. Healthy skepticism that demands rigorous proof, combined with genuine curiosity that doesn't dismiss possibilities just because they seem unlikely. Because here's what these questions really tell us about. They're not ultimately about lost civilizations or ancient mysteries. They're about human potential, about resilience, about what people can accomplish even in the worst circumstances. Your ancestors survived a 117,000-year near-extinction event with nothing but stone tools and their wits. They rebuilt, innovated, spread across the world. They created languages, art, technology, culture. They adapted to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. They crossed oceans, climbed mountains, built cities in deserts where nothing should survive. That's the real story. Not whether some specific vanished civilization existed, but what humanity is capable of when pushed to the edge. What we can create, what we can survive, what we can accomplish. And we're still discovering evidence of that capability. Right now, ground-penetrating radar is revealing structures beneath the jungle that we never knew existed. Satellite imaging is finding ancient roads and cities that have been invisible for millennia. DNA analysis is rewriting population histories we thought we understood. LIDAR is mapping entire civilizations hiding under forest canopy. The technology keeps improving, and every improvement reveals more of what was always there, just hidden, waiting for us to develop the tools to see it. So what happens next? We keep looking. We keep questioning. We keep demanding evidence while staying open to surprise. We keep pushing our understanding of the past backwards and our appreciation for human capability upwards. Because the past isn't dead. It's not even past. It's written in our DNA, preserved in myths and languages, buried under our cities, submerged beneath our oceans. It's waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to look and rigorous enough to prove what they find. That includes you. If this journey, through humanity's hidden history, has sparked something in you, maybe that curiosity leads somewhere. Maybe you visit an archaeological site, read deeper into one of these topics, or simply start questioning the stories you were told about how civilization developed. Maybe you become the person who discovers what everyone else missed. At minimum, you can help spread curiosity. If you enjoyed this exploration, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from, what mysteries you find most compelling. Subscribe so you don't miss future journeys into history's strangest corners. And if you want to support this kind of deep dive content, there's a membership option available, but no pressure. Your attention and curiosity matter more than anything else. The age of invisible civilizations might be ending, not because they're appearing, but because we're finally developing eyes to see what was always hidden. The ghosts of time are becoming visible, and the story they're telling is stranger, richer, and more inspiring than we ever imagined. Sleep well, and keep wondering.